I'm Dr. Marianne.
And I'm Dr. Adam.
And we are
Counselors in Quarantine.
And we are sponsored by our boss, Dr. Lacey Carpillo, Vice President for Student Affairs.
As psychologists in the Counseling Center here at EOU, we thought it would be cool to share with you some nuggets of wisdom that we share with the students we work with.
Yeah, and so this week we wanted to talk to you about the importance of healthy grieving. And the reason we're coming up with the idea of healthy grieving toward the end of the school year is just because the end of the school year, time of huge celebration in so many ways. And it's also a time of transition and losses for a lot of people. Yeah. And one of the things I've noticed in my sessions with students this spring term is just that idea that there's been a lot of loss already with all the stuff happening, that's happened with COVID and classes going remotely and many students moving home. It's like spring term has just been different, and it's been different than what people signed up for, and there are just so many losses connected to that. Yeah. And so we just wanted to talk about kind of some ideas about grief and what grief actually is and how it actually works and the importance of being able to grieve effectively, and then go into what grieving effectively actually looks like.
Yeah, and it's interesting because grieving is something that I think people often try to avoid. Mm-hmm. They try to move away from it. People come into counseling, I'm sad, I don't want to feel this, right. I'm experiencing a loss of some sort. And the way that we work with students is often to move them toward grief rather than away from it, because we know that grief is a very healing emotion when you can work with it rather than having it, sort of work against you.
Yeah, I mean, grief is just like any other pain that we experience in life, right? Like if we touch a hot burner, the tendency is to just pull away from it. And so it's human nature to not want to grieve. It's human nature to pull away from the pain. And the feelings of loss. And so in that sense, then grief actually becomes a skill, or grieving well becomes a skill, because it's not something that we're naturally wired to do. And so if you don't know how to grieve, you can learn how to grieve. And that's important to understand, because we're not going to grieve naturally. Right. Which also means then you have to be intentional about moving toward it.
Right. And I often tell students that I work with that grief really, it just represents value in your life. Yeah. If I lose something and I don't care about it, if I drop a penny, it's okay.
There's not a lot of value in that.
To me, that's not a lot of value in that. But if I lose, a couple $1,000s, I might have to grieve over that, because to me, that's a large sum of money, and that would be really hard and painful. Or to use a personal example, when my father passed away in October, that was really hard for me. And having that conversation with him, I remember him telling me, "Oh, don't cry, I don't want you to feel sad." And my response to him was, "Dad, I'm going to cry and I'm going to feel sad because this relationship is important to me." And I mean, it was hard, but ultimately helpful to go toward that.
Yeah, and I watched you go through that grieving process, and you were very intentional about it. Even though part of you just wanted to push it away and not have to deal with it, you did the work. Right. And I think now that it's, May, several months later, I think you're in a better place, because you did the hard work of grieving.
Well, the interesting thing too is a lot of people ask, is there a timetable for grief? And there really isn't. I find it tends to come in waves. I mean, I'm feeling it right now as we're talking about it, and it's coming up. But you get better at managing it, and the way to move through it is actually to work through the skills that we're talking about. That's what helps the process. While there is no exact timetable, using the skills are what ultimately helps get you to that place of acceptance.
Yeah, and so along with that idea that whatever we feel a loss about, or we feel some pain about losing, and having that be connected to what we value, the other thing is that whatever we don't grieve over actually gets acted out. Yeah. Sure. And so when
anything.
Whatever we don't feel, whatever we don't, own, it'll get acted out. It'll get played out in our life sideways in terms of anger. Just it could go into depression. It could go into symptoms of anxiety. It can go into just irritability. And so if something's off inside of you and you're like, why am I acting this way? Or what am I doing? Or why am I drinking so much? Or why am I eating so much? Or, it is helpful to look inside and say, okay, is there some grief inside that needs to be processed? because a lot of times that's a clue to go to the grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and grieving effectively, doing that kind of work. It's interesting because I think it starts with just naming it and owning it, like you said, like naming those losses, owning those losses. And I love doing this kind of work with students and talking about the difference between when you're naming losses, like what's a real loss, and sometimes what we're losing is like fantasies or projections or ideals.
Oh, yeah.
Like sometimes we have to grieve actually what we never had, like the mom I never had, not you mom if you're watching at home, but like grieving the mom I never had, or when you lose a partner and it's like these dreams and ideals, like we were supposed to build a house together, and so naming what your actual losses are, what are sort of the fantasies that you wish you had. Doing that kind of work can be really helpful to just sort of categorize and start to do that work.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's actually necessary neurologically, because we can't work with our emotions. Our emotions in and of themselves, they're in the limbic system part of our brain, which is like right above our brain stem, and we can't access our limbic system directly. The way that we access our emotion is actually by putting some cognitive structure to it. So naming our losses and doing that loss inventory, which is like a first step in grieving, is critical, because once we name it, we put that cognitive structure to it, then we can actually start working with it. Because we can't tend to grieve over something that we just feel but we haven't identified, and that's where a lot of people get stuck.
Like, I've cried for months. Why am I not over it?
Exactly.
Why is this not getting better?
Right. And so there's a cognitive structure piece that's missing. So you got to name your losses.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then the other part, kind of like Adam said, is it's important to identify the need or the want or the desire that was not met or that was lost.
Or that was met and then lost.
Yeah. And so again, the idea is to name it, because you could say, like, if there's I don't know, losing a pet even, it's like, I lost my dog, my dog died. It's like, okay, that's the narrative, that's the story, but that doesn't say what you actually lost from a sort of a relational perspective, and what you're going to miss. And so you've got to name, like, I lost companionship, I'm going to miss that. I lost, just that, that animal that was there, like whenever I was emotional, it was just there for me, or I lost my best friend, kind of a thing.
Absolutely. And I like to say too, like, what did you lose that's just like having a pet? That like any pet could fill that hole. Right. And then what are the losses associated with that specific pet that nobody's going to replace, that was special, that was our relationship? Right. Really getting specific about naming those things is a good part of that grief work.
Yeah, and then it's really about allowing yourself to feel mad and sad and disappointed and upset and frustrated and angry. I mean, just all the emotion that comes up. And just being able to feel anything and everything, giving yourself permission to protest, because anytime we lose something we don't want to lose, whether we're 2 years old or whether we're 45 years old or 18, it doesn't matter. We're going to protest a loss. And there's value in that protest, because again, it says, I don't like this. This happened to me. And it's important to me, and I don't want to lose it.
And that's really important too, the idea it's important to me. Because when feeling your feelings and giving yourself permission to feel your feelings, we really encourage you to do it free of judgment. Because nothing's really going to grow, you're not going to really move if you're under that judgment. And sometimes we'll take other people's values and apply them to ourselves and say, well, I shouldn't feel bad about this. I shouldn't, I can't, and then it's when other people's narratives seep in, that is a place where we can get stuck in grief work too. So just feel your feelings, own it, and say, even though this isn't important to you, it's important to me. And this is a real loss for me. And we've had those conversations too, where I sit with you and your stuff, and I say, well, to me that's not a big deal, but I get for you it is. And
which takes us to number 4 in grieving effectively. It's so important to share your losses with others.
That was good.
Yeah, good job. He's so intuitive. He's a really good therapist. But share your losses with those who care about you and your feelings, because we're not really meant to grieve alone. And, our Western culture, we tend to do weird things around grieving, whereas there's some other cultures that, just grieving is just, it's a community.
Collective.
Yeah, it's part of the culture, and it's built in because they understand the value of the grieving process. And so getting the love and acceptance and encouragement and affirmation from other people, those relational nutrients actually help us metabolize the losses that we experience in the whatever separation we had with what we lost. So we gotta always connect to people when we're experiencing, I don't know, loss and separation, and that helps us metabolize that.
And number 5, quickly, I mean, because we talked about this before, just knowing that grief, it's a process. You know, it's not a single event that you go through and then it's over and done with. Similar to how I talked about with my dad's story, you know, earlier in the video.
Yeah, and then you know, it is helpful to just go ahead and say the word goodbye to what or whomever you lost. You know, so everything that you listed in your loss inventory, going through the process we just mentioned, and then just saying goodbye to that person or that thing is helpful, because the goodbye process and just even saying goodbye, it's almost like it seals in the goodness of the connection you had, and like the it seals in the goodness. Yes, definitely. And then once we can say goodbye, then we're free to move on.
Right.
Because the other thing about anything that's not grieved over, we tend to hold on to it, and then that prevents us from moving forward in our lives. And so we want to grieve over, and then get to that point of letting go, so that we can truly move on.
Yeah. And so, yeah, hopefully this is helpful for all of you, especially during this time, with everything that's going on. I mean, even if it wasn't COVID times, I would say anytime there's a time of transition, right, you're going to experience some losses.
Right.
And so the seasons are changing, graduation's happening, and yeah, we happen to be living in a crazy time right now where the world's changing and is different. And so hopefully this is helpful for all of you.
Yeah.
And so once again, we want to thank you all for tuning in. We'll be posting more videos in the future. And so know that there's a topic that you'd like to hear more about, or if you have questions about EOU's response to COVID-19, you can go to eou.edu/coronavirus and click the question and comments button.